So hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Laura Rose O'Connor. I'm a junior fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, and I'm grateful to be here hosting this panel. And the panel we have today is called Cooperative Pathways to Disaster Risk Resilience in the Indo-Pacific, which is a really salient issue, and I think we have a great group here to talk about it. So as Shreya alluded to, this event is one of the first events, the first official webinar of the Indo-Pacific Circle. The Indo-Pacific Circle is, a couple people here know, but it's a Scholar Connect program that was created by the Council for Strategic and Defense Research and the Center for Policy Research. And it's bringing together now around 80 early mid-career scholars in the Indo-Pacific working on emerging issues in the region. So the issue we're here to talk about today is, of course, disaster risk resilience, but the IPC is covering a really wide range of issues, and we'll be having more webinars. So when I'm done my opening remarks, I'll just put the URL and the Twitter handle for IPC in the chat, and you guys are welcome to check it out. So our panel today is chaired by Professor Anil Kumar Gupta, a resilience and sustainability strategist with 3 decades of experience. And he's also the Director of Projects and Center for Excellence, Head of Division and E-Learning and Media Portfolio, International Cooperation, Technical Advisory and Consultancy Services as a full professor at India's National Institute on Disaster Management here in Delhi. On our panel today, we also have Dr. Lina Gong, who is a research fellow with the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Program at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, NTU. She's also a member of the Indo-Pacific Circle. And then we have Dr. Himanshu Grover, who is an assistant professor and the co-director of the Institute for Hazard Mitigation and Planning at the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington, and he's joining us from Seattle. Thank you. We also have Ms. Nayati Gupta, who I'm just seeing her now, and she is an architect in the late stages of her PhD in disaster resilient healthcare infrastructure. And she's also a research analyst in the risk and adaptation team at the Council for Energy, Environment, and Water. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Shreya Upadhyay, who is an assistant professor at Christ deemed to be University, Bangalore, where she teaches international relations and the Indian political system and all of the issues within that. Sorry, I have a cat outside. But Dr. Upadhyay is also a member of the Indo-Pacific Circle as well. So the opening remarks, I'm keeping it very brief, just some housekeeping. In a couple moments, I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Gupta, who's going to chair our panel for about 40 minutes. After that, there's going to be a Q&A session. It's going to last for about 20 minutes. Our Zoom attendee number is it's only about 10 people, so we might, that might be a briefer Q&A, we'll see. Audience members, you're only going to be able to unmute yourself during the Q&A session after you raise your hand and we unmute for the question. That being said, you can put it in the chat and I can ask it for you as well. And last but not least, I noted this earlier, but we are recording this and we're putting it on YouTube as well. So if you'd like to refer back to it, if you would like to see further engagement on YouTube, we will email that link to you afterwards. And that's all from my end. I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Gupta. And thank you to everybody for being here.
So very good morning from New Delhi to everyone. And thank you, Laura, for setting the stage and briefly introducing the speakers of the day. And first of all, my compliments to the Council for Social and Defense Research for taking this very, very important topic for this discussion. The Asia-Pacific, if we talk about the geographical and ecological setting, so that represents, I think, almost all kind of disaster-related challenges, and that represents a kind of a living lab for all those who are interested in the subject of natural hazards or the other kind of disasters, including the technical hazards. Past 2 years, we have witnessed a new kind of disaster challenge that was because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the beginning, no one thought that it will become something that will be required to be dealt as a one of the major disaster, rather global kind of disaster. But it has left us with a number of lessons to improve our disaster management system as well. So a wide-ranging experiences we have, but besides that, the Asia Pacific also presents a wide-ranging set of challenges. For example, the challenges of small islands states are very different from those of the larger countries like India and the China and other countries. So, but we also had the experience of dealing with complex emergencies like the incident of Fukushima. We cannot forget. And in fact, if we start looking back to our history, major disaster challenges, for example, the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, that had led to major initiatives in many of the countries, including India, also enacted its national legislation on disaster management in 2005, just 1 year after the Indian Ocean tsunami. So similarly, many of the countries learned the lessons. But what is again important when we talk about this reason, that broadly in almost all the countries there is a high pace of infrastructure development. So that is a common uh, experience we have. And on the other hand, if we look at the loss and damages during disasters, we find that with the improvement in early warning systems, with an improvement in the local level preparedness, we have been able to reduce the loss of life. But on the other hand, the losses to infrastructure, losses to livelihood, losses to health related resources, losses to agriculture and other livelihood resources. So broadly, there is a shift from loss to life to now losses more in the terms of economic loss and damage. So this is also a new lesson for Asia Pacific to revisit its own disaster management strategy and to come out with a new layers of understanding in our preparedness. So there are issues of technological advances, there are issues of the economic and ecological sustainability, there are also issues of a cultural background in these geographies, because each and every country, if we look in the Asia Pacific, has its a lot of traditional wisdom also to deal with these kind of disasters which have been taking place since ages. So how do we integrate modern technology with the traditional and local knowledge? I think there are a number of questions. So I'm really very happy that there are 4 expert panelists with us, which are coming from wide-ranging background, as Laura has already introduced them. We have planners, we have architects, we have the expert working on international and US relations, we have the expert working on humanitarian assistance and logistic related issues. So I think wide-ranging discussions are going to take place, and that will help us review the current journey of disaster risk reduction that is there in place. And today's this discussion by this council comes very rightly and very timely, because just a week after we are going to have the global platform for disaster risk management taking place at Bali in Indonesia. So I think the outcomes of today's discussion some or other way also would helpful in feeding and our strategic recommendations to the discourse that takes place there. So it's really wonderful chairing this session and talking to you all. So Laura, should I invite the speakers, or you are going to intervene here?
So we're going to begin with opening remarks, and Dr. Lena Gong is up first.
Yeah. So are you going to tell something? Any more rules?
Dr. Lena Gong is, no, she's going to begin her opening remarks for about 5 minutes right now.
Yeah, thank you for Professor Gupta's opening remarks, as well as IPC's invitation for me to join this very important discussion on this topic that is quite crucial for the Indo-Pacific region. I believe actually Professor Gupta has given a very comprehensive introductory remarks about the importance of the topic. So just a few points to add to that. So the first one is that why disaster resilience is important. It is because first, the region is very highly disaster prone. In Southeast Asia, disaster management, or now we call disaster resilience, is one of the key issues or areas that bring countries together to build regional cooperation. Actually, in my personal observation, it is one of the areas that has achieved the highest or the higher level of institutionalization. So it's an issue to bring countries together, to build common identity, to enhance regional integration, because it is a really life or survival threatening issue for the region. And the second one is the impact of climate change, as Professor Gupta just mentioned. Climate change increase the severity, frequency, and damage of disasters. And as we have witnessed during COVID-19, and because of COVID-19, because of climate change, and because of disasters, we often have a concurring challenges or disasters. For example, we have seen during Tonga, after the volcano eruption and the tsunami, the delivery of disaster relief has become more complicated because you also want to prevent the spread of COVID-19 during the response operation. And the next point is that we have seen a shift from our response to disaster resilience or risk reduction, or the disaster resilience concept. Why it is important currently, the focus of the disaster management community still primarily on response, because this is the operation or the phase that attracts most attention, that can have higher impact on media, on public opinion. So according to our research, I can't remember the exact number, but disaster response, the funding for disaster response actually accounts for either 80 or 90% of the overall funding for disaster management or resilience. Well, research have shown that actually every $1 invested in resilience building or disaster risk reduction actually can avoid $4 to $7 spent on response. And so this means that we should increase our investment in preparedness, mitigation, and post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. And the next point I want to add is that the use of technology. We have seen the significant advancement of technology and the wide use of various kinds of technologies in disaster management, from forecast to a needs assessment. We have seen all these kind of modeling that has been used to help responders to respond more effectively, more swiftly. And also we have seen the use of technologies such as blockchain technology to the delivery of aid. So we have seen all these kind of interesting development in this field. And then last point will be the importance of cooperation, because we have seen in this region in particular particular mega scale or large scale disasters that are beyond the capability of a single country to deal with. So disaster cooperation has been a main channel for countries to cooperate with each other to maintain dialogues. So that's the end of my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next opening speaker or opening remarks is going to be Dr. Himanshu Grover.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gong, and thank you, Professor Gupta. Very interesting opening to a very good discussion. I'm going to I will not repeat what you both have said, but rather I'll kind of talk a little more about, based on my experiences, direct experiences in India, in Nepal, and the region, and my experiences back in the US. So I think one of the issues or the challenges that we have for cooperation for disaster resilience in this region is primarily related to the geopolitical tensions. Historically, disasters have been used as a means or as tools for extending geopolitical influence. A typical example, let's say, is the Nepal earthquake. You could see India and China kind of competing with each other as to who provides what technology, who does what. I have a personal experience where I took drones here from the US to do post-disaster damage. So the first time we took them, they were allowed through and we were able to do the assessment. When we went after another 2 months, they were confiscated at the airport because it seems China had put pressure on Nepal not to allow drones of Indian origin people to come in and do reconnaissance of the disaster damages. And so, I mean, that really put us behind in terms of trying to assess, especially in the interior areas. So the aid delivery was like reduced by almost a month, things that could have got done earlier. So that is a big challenge in this region. And if any kind of disaster resilience or any kind of a disaster cooperation has to take that into account. One of the other things that I think the region, one of the issues has been is that disaster, like Dr. Gong said, most of the emphasis in this region has been on disaster response and recovery, more on response rather than recovery, which is led by defense services, so the defense forces. So that becomes a little more challenging for other countries to accept help by allowing defense forces of another nation to be on their soil. So I think that is one of the bigger challenges, and we need to think about how through public policy and through timely interventions, how we can mainstream disaster management as part of the development policy, rather than just keeping it siloed in disasters. And one final, rather two more points. One, these are more like my pessimistic self of myself after looking at what's been happening. I have noticed, especially in the Indian subcontinent and surrounding areas, the Pacific region, post-disasters, there is this great emphasis on the resilience of the people. Resilience of the people is not community resilience, it's failure of community resilience. If people are made to fend for themselves and take care of themselves following a disaster, it's failure of the disaster policy. The idea of an effective national disaster or local disaster policy is to have systems in place, to have support capacity in place so that the people who have been directly impacted do not have to go and fend for themselves or be just waiting for neighborly help to do this. So I think we have to be able to change that narrative where community resilience or disaster resilience is being misrepresented as putting the onus on the actual people who are impacted to, they are more resilient. That is not disaster resilience. And finally, in terms of the, I would say the administrative and the political system, the way it is, you won't believe how many times I've heard that disasters are good for everyone. The people who are impacted usually are the ones who are worst off. They get a lot of grants and money that comes in, or direct donations. The local politicians and the businesses get more money to recover. I'm going to give you a very good example. I have two examples. Nepal, we went there post-disaster recovery. People were worried in the first week, but by the third week, people who were not directly impacted were very happy because the salaries went up. This shot up. Like we were able to hire a taxi for I think 3,000 Nepali rupees initially on the first week. By the third week, I had to pay $1,000 because UNICEF came in and everybody came in and they were paying the international rates. In India, post-tsunami, I was there. We had a National Science Foundation grant to go and survey in the Chennai and Nagapattinam region. People who were not directly impacted were very happy because all these nonprofits came in, gave them new boats, gave them money, gave them food, and they were all happy about it. But the problem was that everybody in these small villages along Nagapattinam got a boat and an engine. So nobody, but when we went after 8 months, we saw they were all lying on the beach, all with fancy names and letterings and stuff of who all donated them, but nobody was fishing. And the reason was because these were given to almost each and every household in the village, which disrupted the whole fishing system. A boat needs different levels of expertise and different people to run the whole fishing business. Somebody who knows how to throw the line, somebody who knows to take care of the fish, somebody who sells it and all. So when he made everybody a boat owner, nobody was willing to work for each other. So what I'm trying to say here is that we need to kind of break this cycle of where people see disasters as opportunities for getting more money in or getting more resources in. I mean, and I'm not saying that it's just in this region. I know even in the US, I meet with the small city officials, and if we tell them your bridges, are really in a bad shape, they're like, it's okay if we put in money right now. I have to rebuild this bridge. It'll take me about $8 to $10 million. Whereas if the bridge actually falls down, I get 35 million from the federal government to rebuild it and maintain it for the next 10 years. So I think therein lies the problem that we have to kind of influence our local systems to kind of think about disaster prevention as the best way, rather than just trying to manage and to kind of respond and recover from that. Thank you.
Thank you really much. Thank you very much. It's really interesting. And our next speaker who's going to be giving opening remarks is Ms. Nayati Gupta. I also don't think I've gotten the chance to say hi to Ms. Gupta. So hello.
Yeah, hi. Is it okay if I share my screen and present, or do you want me to just speak and not present? Because I don't have the host controls. I cannot share my screen.
Here, I'll just send a message to Gaurav. There you go.
Or, yeah. Yeah, you can see my presentation, right? Is the presentation visible to you all?
Very
Yeah.
much.
Yes,
Okay, thank you, Dr. Grover and Dr. Gong and Professor Gupta. So I won't exactly be continuing on the idea of what exactly DRR is and move towards the geopolitics and the technology side of it, but also to present what on behalf of the council and otherwise the policy research institutions are doing with respect to mapping the trajectory of the DRR. So moving on towards how exactly the DRR trajectory looked like from the Hugo framework to how it was pointed out in the Sendai framework and how it was recognized by the Asian Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, where the PM 10-point agenda was launched, which was highly beneficial for the government of India and for the region specificity of the Asia-related institutions. In that, major focus was given on the climate proofing or the critical infrastructure and services for ensuring the well-being of the society, apart from various data-driven processes and the financing mechanism that Dr. Grover talked about. So all of this were taken into consideration and moving around the nuances of how the PM 10-point agenda works. The Delhi Declaration also came up with a model to implement the Sendai framework in the Southeast Asia region. When we talk about Asia-specific challenges, as highlighted in the IPCC AR6 report also, a lot of focus has been given to agriculture, specifically the crop failure and the livestock, which is estimated to increase about 40%. Another was the highlighting the vulnerability of the total global population, along with the impacted job sustainability and productivity because of the climatically stressful days. Amidst all of these, the government of India pledged in COP26 to become carbon neutral by 2070, which is great, which is what is needed. But it is also a tightrope between becoming a $5 trillion economy, which is with financial year 2029. So there has to be some sort of a technical, systematic, and financial balance to achieve the trillion economy and along with becoming carbon neutral by 2070. A recent study which is done by CEW highlights that about 27 states out of 35 states and the union territories in India are extreme weather event hotspot. And by extreme weather event hotspot, we mean prone to flooding, drought, and cyclones specifically. And it highlights the the technical requirement of increasing the adaptive capacity and reduce the disaster risks. Apart from that, when we talk about the regional risk, given the global temperature rise from 1.5 degree to 3 degrees Celsius, there is a huge loss with respect to the biodiversity and the increment in floods and drought and extreme heat levels, specifically in Asia, which has a deteriorating impact on the ecosystem and the humanitarian system, which is adversing to the crisis. So when we talk about the adaptation methods or the technical methods through which certain kind of a balance can be achieved, we also talk about certain kind of a financial mechanism. What exactly would be the financial gains? So it was projected in the Global Climate Adaptation Report on Adaptation and Resilience that by investing 1.8 trillion globally in the span over a decade can generate about more than six-fold increase in the total net benefits. So when we look at the total financial benefits of it, not exactly the benefits that Dr. Grover talked about, which was more on the side of the geopolitical agenda, but investing in that sort of adaptation techniques can lead to strike some sort of a optimal balance which is required. So one of the balancing techniques is that now called as ecosystem-based solution or the nature-based solution under the larger umbrella, is to increase the larger amount of the green cover or the blue-green infrastructure that we are talking about, apart from increasing community engagement. So for example, in Odisha, it is one of the model state, which is not only for India, but in the South Asian region, through which community engagement and disaster risk resilience can be adhered to or referred to in terms of reducing down not only the casualties, but in terms of making robust mechanism and build back better techniques with respect to the housing and the relief and the immediate relief centers that the Odisha State Development Authority came up with. So that is one of the model states which one should adhere to, given the kind of disasters that it has been projected to. So when we talk about the preparedness of the DRR tool itself, DRR or any kind of a decision support system or a decision support tool that we are talking about mostly in terms of the analytics of the disaster risks, which is in terms of climate modeling and mining. Given the advances that the climate-based modeling in the mining has done, it can be plugged into a big data system through multi-hazard scenario to capitalize the digital technology. And when we talk about the digital identity, like Professor Gupta highlighted about the blockchain mechanism along with Dr. Gon, so we also are talking about rapid diagnostic and better communication and the governance strategy in terms of delivering the health, for example. So not only in terms of telemedicine, but also telehealth. So for example, India's real estate sector after COVID-19 pandemic has started on the lines of providing an additional room in the apartment building itself, which can be converted into a home ICU facility. And that is the kind of telehealth and telemedicine delivery that we are talking about. So apart from the technical delivery, we are also looking into the fintech mechanisms with respect to financing, adaptation, resilience, which is what Asia needs right now. So with this note, I would like to end this. So right from moving towards geopolitical standards and the technical standards, I think the fintech is something that one has to look into, apart from the robust systematic mechanisms, which can be maybe taken forward by Dr. Shreya in her discussion.
Yes.
Thank you
So
so
shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. I think everyone has already spoken what was there in my mind. I will try to bring out some other aspects. I would like to talk about environmental disasters, not only from the environmental perspective and not from just how it impacts people, but also the how it has an impact on security and the kind of opportunities that it can provide to different states. As it has already been pointed out, that Indian Ocean is known as a hazard belt. It has climatic, geological disasters, cyclones, tsunamis that have been occurring with fair regularity. And it's not just the cyclones and the tsunamis, but also different kinds of environmental pollution, or the marine pollution, or diminishing fish stocks that have an impact not only on people's livelihoods and lives, but also, frankly, how nations behave with each other. And a brilliant example in this regard is how it was the overfishing in the Indian Ocean that led to the Somali piracy issue, which ultimately led to militarization of the ocean. A lot of times these non-traditional threats not only endangers lives and livelihoods, but also generate more traditional and more state-centric lateral concerns. And so the disasters in any case are transnational in character, and they have the potential to either damage or to create cooperation between states, or between multilateral institutions and minilateral institutions in that regard. COVID-19, as we saw, again, brought out, unfortunately, the disaster climate health nexus. And, even as COVID-19 was on or is currently ongoing, ultimately, any kind of the disasters continue to take place. And in any of these disasters, the established methods of prevention, response, and recovery, all of these were then interrupted by lockdowns, by travel restrictions, by containment measures that were imposed. And they also, ultimately, these hazards that took place, they also hampered the response to the pandemic, and also facilitated the spread of virus, because people often had to crowd together in emergency shelters. And so this convergence of biological and other natural hazards added to the underlying drivers of vulnerability, poverty, inequality, unplanned rapid urbanization, all of which damage the life prospects of millions of people. And also it brought forth how risks are interconnected, and how these systemic risks, biological, hydro, meteorological, will be impacted by changing climate. But it also brought it was a time for major technological improvements that could be used for disaster risk resilience. And in this case, I would want to now then talk about the aspect of minilateral organizations or multilateral organizations. And nobody really has talked about Quad here till now. So Quad, as we know, is basically coming together of countries, India, Australia, Japan, and USA, especially after the idea of Quad emerged after the 2004 tsunami, and how these countries came together to to sort of deal with hazards. And in the last few years, and then obviously Quad, the idea of Quad was created, but then it just couldn't keep up. But it has made a comeback. And now that it has made a comeback, it is working also on emphasizing its soft security dimensions, which also includes cooperation through infrastructure development, through capacity building, through connectivity. And India's HARD efforts have gained prominence since the 2004 tsunami. And India wants to showcase itself. There are a lot more things that it can do to make things better, but it wants to, at least it has the intent to be the first responder and a leading actor during these emergencies. And for this, it has in fact bolstered since 2004. It has bolstered its disaster assistance by acquiring, things like landing platform docks, by investing in large landing ship tanks, by having, Chinooks helicopters, or Indian Air Force also has C-17 Globemaster, C-130 Super Hercules, which strengthens the disaster relief potential. And along with that, it has been working, it was earlier working bilaterally with Australia, with US, with Japan. And now all of these countries have come together to sort of work well. It has used regional forums like the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, Indian Ocean Rim Organization, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, again, to establish cooperative mechanisms. This is not to say that we're doing very well, because even now, the HARD agenda on Quad is unclear. Sometimes the Quad leaders come together and they talk about responding to global challenges, but then sometimes it also doesn't find any mention when the leaders meet. And a lot of times, even HARD is, Quad's agenda is aimed at largely targeting China. So there is a larger, a political angle, geopolitical angle at play also. But the idea is that once you have a robust, a minilateral organization or several minilateral organizations dealing with the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, what happens is that you also build ties with armed forces of other countries, as well as nations of other regions. And because these disaster responses employ the same platforms and capabilities that also project hard power. Ultimately, the ships that carry relief supplies, tents and clothes and relief workers can also ferry troops and tanks during war times. The same aircrafts looking for missing aircrafts can look for enemy submarines and take on enemy aircraft. So the idea is that once you project a certain kind of soft power, you're also building on the hard power. Now, it should be a win-win situation, and I'm just going to sort of wrap up. It should be a win-win situation for at least the the nations, the countries that are working alongside. But that's not always the case, because again, a lot of geopolitical issues, come up. So there are egos, there are nations' egos. So sometimes, Bangladesh would not accept India's, help or assistance, or India and China would be competing for soft power in Nepal. So a lot of these things also come in the picture. So with that, I'm just going to wrap it up, and we can discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers. I'm just going to pass the floor to Professor Gupta, who's going to share the discussion now. And just so you know, we're adding 5 minutes to the panel, so we'll go into 11:45 before entering the Q&A.
Thank you. In fact, this has been a wonderful round of introductory remarks by all the speakers, and that has also reflected their wide-ranging thinking. on this subject, starting from technological dimensions to environmental disasters to the supply chain issues, and also the international relations and planning related issues. So now, in fact, we'll have few kind of key questions, and this panel round, we will have, I think, 2 or 3 rounds of brief reflection. So, first round, let us discuss that how do we see the technological advances over the region that have taken place, and how do we see the ongoing the fast pace of change in the technology domain, particularly the disruptive technology, because in the discussion, the telemedicine and these things have also been reflected, the use of drones and these kind of things also reflected. What are the viewpoints of the panelists on this subject, that how do we think of some kind of a policy, the strategic interventions or policy interventions, and also a blending of modern technology with traditional wisdom. So two major things that I always see and talk about, that the disruptive technology, particularly like nanotechnology, besides ICT, and then the robotics is moving very fast, and that is also of significant use in disaster management also, and disaster risk reduction. So I think we can have some reflection on the panelists, and the second question that will come on, that how regional cooperation can work better. So for the reflection on technological dimensions, first I will come to Dr. Elena, as she is working with the humanitarian dimensions, and she also reflected on supply chain issues. So how do you see this, Dr. Lena? And then I will come to Dr. Himanshu on this question. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Gupta.
Yeah.
I believe at least two points are very important. The first one is standards or common code of conduct. So it is, in my view, it is important to at least have a set of guidelines, either at regional level, that different stakeholders can agree with each other to ensure the proper and appropriate use of technologies, to avoid misuse of technology. And the second one I think is more important is whether these technologies are accessible, available for the communities, especially the vulnerable groups, those who are actually in underprivileged position, which in normal times are already like lack of access to technologies and all these assistance. So while we are promoting the use of technologies, it is quite important to ensure that they are accessible, they are beneficial to the vulnerable groups. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I totally agree, and I find this recommendation very useful, that how do we come out with some kind of a common code of conduct, and then also see that whether how easily that can be followed and what are the repercussions. So what are your viewpoints, Dr. Himanshu, on this issue, because you also referred to this very important aspect?
Yeah, I kind of differ in my opinion. I think the basis of disruptive technology is not to have anything common core. It has to be crowd-based. It is, I mean, I'll give you a very good example. Again, because the things I've worked with, like the Nepal earthquake, people just came on to do satellite imagery processing to tell us which areas are more hit, which were worse off and all. If we were, there was one group like I think the UNCHR or somebody who was trying to create a kind of a portal where they would specify how to do the screening of the pictures, how to do this and that, prepare guidelines. That was totally useless because people were just put off by there. And then this dump of Google satellite photographs came on, and people sitting on their home computers came up, oh yeah, I think this is this. And then it's easy. We can use AI to kind of corroborate across multiple users and do it. So when we have the technology, which can actually disrupt the need for having all these systems, frameworks, limitations in place. I mean, we're in an era where nobody wants to observe all the rules. You don't need rules to be, doing things that can be done clearly. I know there are drawbacks to it, there are issues to it, but then everything has a problem. There's a positive and a negative with everything. And so one of the reasons is we can sit back and think about how do we create a common code of conduct where everybody can agree to, or we can just go ahead and do the best we can with what we have. That's one of my things. The other thing I've been talking about, I've been working with some of the grassroots groups in India of how to develop technology to, I would say, inform risk. I think one of the main issues, again, that's my personal opinion based on my training, is that if you're aware of your risk, you'll do the best to avoid that risk or to mitigate that risk. Nobody wants to stand in front of a running bus. If they know the bus is going to hit them, they will try to avoid it. The problem comes is when we think of risk assessments, risk as kind of a proprietary knowledge that the government wants to keep to themselves, or universities or researchers don't want to share it. I think we should make risk information more accessible, and that's where technology comes in. Why cannot we have a layer of, on Google Map, we have risk coming in, this is your earthquake risk zone, this is a possible flooding risk zone. A lot of my work in the US now, we've been pushing forward for flood risk. So a lot of our real estate websites I talk about, they provide risk ratings now. And this information was already there. We just forced them and pushed them to put this out there, because if they didn't do it, we would do it. So I think these are the couple of things that I feel passionately about is we need to harness the power of people. Crowdsourcing is pretty good. We don't need detailed frameworks. We need some kind of a common platform. That's all. As long as we can translate each other's knowledge, then we can harness AI to actually corroborate a lot of issues that we've had in the past and make sure things don't go bad. Things will go bad somewhere or the other, but that doesn't mean that you just stop doing it. You just become better the next time. And the second part being that I totally lost my chain of thought. Right. So I talked to you about the technology, and the third one was about risk awareness, making the knowledge more public. Public accessibility, I think, is the key. If more people are aware of the risk, the more they will participate in reducing that risk.
Thank you, Dr. Himanshu. And I think this also gives some idea that common but differentiated models. So basically, partly we can have some flexibility, and partly we can have some kind of a frame. So that comes in as the recommendation between the deliberation by Dr. Himanshu and Dr. Lena. And because this comes from the experience of dealing with past disasters also. However, it is also important, what I feel, that when we talk about the risk knowledge to community, what is the language, the composition of the narration, so that the people can really perceive what really we want to convey to them. Many times, everything is there in the public domain, but community or the people are not able to understand. So I think that is also very important, because even in the domain of climate change, we talk of the weather data products. Because all these flashy graphs and curves, the farmers are not able to draw the conclusion that whether they have to use a different variety, or whether they have to delay their sowing or something like that. So how do you see, Dr. Shreya, because you are also dealing with the international relations issues also, and all the countries in the region also having a varying level of understanding and technological, I would say that capacities, the capacities to transfer knowledge to community language, or otherwise also. What are your reflections on this?
Okay, thank you, Professor Gupta. Yeah, so I would like to talk about two things. As you said, first is about capacity building. So we see that not all nations have the same kind of capacity in place. Even when it comes to the basic things that we need today in terms of letting people know in terms of doing some kind of predictive analytics, doing some kind of risk modeling is, the idea is that you are able to tell it to people in simple language. That is a major problem. Second, even things like not everyone has a great internet connection. So you also need to work on reliable and fast internet, and that is where for a resilient communications infrastructure, and that is why the entire debate about 5G and all of those, this also comes in, wherein how to ensure that internet is or any kind of information is not just sort of usurped by either one nation or one power and things like that. You need a much more collaborative effort. But how will it take place when there is major trust deficit between, say, for example, India and Pakistan, or India and Sri Lanka? So we need to work in a much more collaborative manner to have that access of technology for everyone. So having a fast, reliable internet, for example, having an need for a broader coverage through Earth observation, through connected cameras or sensors, and ensuring that that information is accessible by everyone. And the second point that I would like to talk about is, I think the light lies in a kind of cooperation that can take place between public-private partnership, something which is extremely important. So if you see, risk management in companies is a fairly new, a new aspect that has come in the last 10 years, 15 years. And frankly, after COVID-19, all these organizations started to take the risk management as, in a fairly seriously. And so a lot of times the Amazons and the Ubers of the world would have, frankly, or the Fidelities of the world would have more information about the geopolitical events that are going to take place, or the disasters that might strike, because they frankly have the money and a lot of, their earnings are, and the profit maximization are at stake. So why can't governments or organizations at the regional or the sub-regional level come together and combine that kind of information, giving and gathering from them, and then use it to disseminate, because the kind of information that they are able to disseminate to their workers, their employees, their vendors is actually, frankly, put out in a way that everyone can understand that information. And that's something which is very important right now.
Thank you, Shreya. I agree that, and more particularly in the COVID period, the thought process in corporate systems and industry that risk management is an integral part, and even the horizon of the risk management, because earlier the disaster related issues were seldom considered as a part of the risk management strategy in corporate sector. But now they have realized that how much loss is there when there is a cyclone, that if you look the example of docks and ports, that how the challenges, and during the lockdown period, and even the unlocking of the industry, the kind of challenges the industries had to face. So those are important issues. And another point that you reflected, but this is also a reality that disaster diplomacy is also has a lot of positive sides, because this is the diplomacy of cooperation rather than harming to each other. So certainly there is a much better scope of cooperation, and I would say that the regional brotherhood also. So thank you for pointing out that. Now coming to Niyati on this issue, because she has been working on the resilient health infrastructure issues also. And recently in India, we have come up with a national health adaptation plan that also deal with disaster risk management issue. So certainly having a better policy at national level, that is good. But how do we really take that at the ground level? That is the big challenge, and the kind of the weaknesses and inadequacies that we have witnessed during COVID also give a lot of lessons for us. And certainly the governments, not only government of India, many of the governments in the region are now reworking on their health system strengthening. So how do you see that the technological dimensions like the telecommunication, the use of telecommunication, these kind of things, are how do we improve our the cold chain systems and this to meet the demands of this? And then can there be international cooperation on also in this line, or some kind of a regional cooperation? Yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you for this very, very good question, which is absolutely of my interest. In the past 2.5 years, I think all of us have been connected to healthcare more than ever. We have not seen as much of a discrepancies with respect to the healthcare delivery, and never felt so connected, which is both sad and good in a way, that to see what exactly the kind of healthcare system that we live in. So coming to the question of how it can be, so I think the question can be in two parts. One is like how it can be implemented on ground, and other is the technological interventions that we seek either at the international level or at a national level also, for better telecommunication governance, recovery, and possibly the telemedicine, right? So addressing, coming back to the first thing, how it can be done on ground. So specifically, when we are talking about India, we are talking about primary healthcare, community healthcare systems, which is the secondary healthcare, and then tertiary. So tertiary healthcare has a huge responsibility in terms of resource mobilization over to the primary and the secondary ones. So despite when there is a big, because of any kind of an extreme event or a disaster, or even during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there is an influx of patients, or there is a patient surge in the given OPD capacity of the institute or the healthcare institutions, there's a dire need to mobilize the kind of medical resources that India has over to the district, secondary, or a primary level of institutions. The other part to the implementation is the kind of financial mechanisms that are there to make the primary and the secondary healthcare systems become more robust. So by financial mechanisms, we mean, so like, for example, installation of, let's say, oxygen capacity within the premises. So not only the systematic approach towards changing or amending the bylaws changed in order to put out the oxygen oxygen manufacturing units in the small nursing homes, ranging from 50 bed capacity to 100 bed capacity, but it is also about changing, getting into some kind of a funding towards the government institutions with respect to the primary and the secondary healthcare. And that is the kind of robust resource mobilization that we need to think upon and implement it. When we talk about the India's adaptation plan over health, it also talks about various kind of health adversities that a climate change is inducing. So for example, what are the kind of adverse effect on the health because of the heat waves? So there are certain adversities associated with respect to flooding, with respect to cyclones, with respect to drought, or heat waves per se, which is specifically attributing towards health. So what is the kind of reduction in the hospital-acquired infections, and the kind of robust health mechanism that we have to upgrade to, so that there is like certain kind of a balance with respect to the adversities or the rising in the global temperatures? That is another thing. The last part of the question, when it comes to telemedications and including technology when it comes to the PHC, CHCs, or the THCs to work for in the healthcare setup. So I agree to an extent, I agree to Dr. Shreya's point where she talked about profit maximization of the corporate entities. So a huge role, even during past 2.5 years, was played by companies like 1mg, which could provide healthcare services to your doorsteps, and not only in terms of medicine, but also in terms of kind of the checkups, that frequent checkups that one has to go through. Of course, there will be a incentive of a profit maximization, because that is what they are for in a way. And that is where the government can intervene in between and sort of give that sort of access to every other citizen and not just for the ones who can afford it in that sense. So there are definitely certain kind of a regulation which is required in terms of setting up these kind of tech boom that is there with respect to the healthcare. But at the same time, the regulatory mechanism can ensure the sort of access which can be given to the common public, especially in wake of the disasters. So yeah.
Thank you, Niyati. And I think diverse but very important issues have emerged, and there are a couple of common points that also emerged. That I think this is a huge area that DRR need to work. That they optimizing the technology use for improving DRR, but certainly leveraging some kind of a flexibility
Yes.
while to guide the process and to allow people, and also how communities can take the benefit. Now this is also an important aspect, that when we look at the reason perspective. So countries have wide-ranging set of disaster vulnerability. For example, the Pacific Islands have different set of this thing, and for them even the preparedness for El Nino is very, very important. However, the impact of El Nino is felt in India also, but in a different form, that more in the form of La Nina, others. But certainly when it comes to planning for disaster risk reduction, then the things become a little diverse, because India, if we talk of the national plan, then we have to cover a wide ranging issues. We have to cover the hill related disasters also, coastal related disasters also. So there are also great scope that we can enrich cooperation among the countries, not only in the time of planning and preparedness, but also during disaster response. Certainly disaster response, now most of the time we talk that disaster response is always focused, and we should have more focus on disaster preparedness and prevention. I think everyone will agree to that. But this international cooperation sometimes becomes very emergent when there are transboundary kind of disasters or major disasters. So how do we look at this, and how do we look at the sharing knowledge? I think the previous round also reflected to sharing knowledge among the countries, where many times we sit in the delegations also, and sometimes we have to keep silent on the matter when it comes to about data, because there are various issues of resources also involved. Another aspect that also comes to my mind, my own experience, I was a part of the bilateral cooperation meeting, and even there are aspects where we have great opportunity to learn from each other. I recall that the delegation from Japan suggesting that they have a lot to learn on community-based disaster preparedness and disaster management system from the various parts that India had. So there are areas where we have to learn from each other in area of technological application, but also the innovations. And how do we really look at the innovations in various countries, not only India, even smaller countries, there may be a good number of innovations. How do we really look at it, look at those, how do we document those, and then integrate into the learning process? So I think the final round of reflection I would like to have from you. And this time I would request that let us be a little brief. So we'll have around 10 or 12 minutes for the overall. So maybe 1 or 2 minutes for each of the speakers. So I will begin with can I begin with you, Dr. Himanshu? And then I'll go to Niyati, and then Lima, and then to Shreya.
Yeah, sure. So could you repeat the question exactly what you wanted to say?
Yeah, basically, I want to ask you in a summary, what are the key aspects of regional cooperation that you look at?
So I think I posted an answer to one of the questions also on that. I think when you mentioned about post-disaster, those systems evolve, the cooperation needs to evolve. Corporations cannot evolve in organizations that have not cooperated for years. So all this has to start before a disaster, if it is institutional cooperation. In my opinion, the best way is to have kind of non-governmental agencies to take a lead and create these platforms for cooperation. They don't need to create agreements, they need to create just a framework. Simple thing could be create a website of a resilience corps or disaster partners, get people to enroll. Whenever there's a need, get them to cooperate, and they do it, let it happen naturally. Then we see that those emergent organizations and groups exist everywhere. That's what happens. That's what actually solves most of our disaster problems. So I would say we really don't need a major agreements and all. Let it just provide a platform to do it, and that would work. I do want to point on one more thing. I mean, one of the speakers did mention about getting knowledge from Amazons and Microsofts and all. No, they don't have any extra knowledge. I assure you, I teach the people who go into Amazon and Microsoft. They have been talking about disasters from last 6 to 7 decades, not recently, but they are motivated by profit, not by benefit to the society. So their kind of disaster planning is what we do not need for communities. We don't want the disaster planning. Thanks.
So thanks, Dr. Himanshu. I partly agree with you that civil society networks are very important. But many times when there are state involved, so certainly they have to work together. So some kind of a broad framework. So like in India, we have the state-led disaster management system, but we have the opportunities and we integrate. So basically, whenever there is a disaster response needs, so we have an integrated response mechanism. So all those agencies, whether it is a defense force, whether it is, so there is a command system, and then we are integrating. But there are a lot to do during peacetime, that we say that pre-disaster. There is a huge roles and responsibilities for all the organizations. Even when there is a difference of opinion, so that is also can be accepted. So over to Niyati for your brief remarks on this.
Yeah. So I also partly agree with Dr. Grover that there is a dire need to get into certain kind of non-governmental organization and get into a certain platform where there can be certain kind of a convergence and resonance with the kind of thought process that the government and the private and whosoever has. At the same time, I also want to point out, extending to the view that you have overlapping it with the Google map, the kind of risk profile that we have. I think that has to be again diverged into two aspects. One, where that particular technology is helping the decision makers or the policy makers, bureaucrats and the technocrats, and the other which is targeting to the target groups, let's say, which can be interpreted by the farmer itself. So the interface itself has to be two-faced. And then only that particular kind of a vulnerability or the climate risk atlas that we are looking for India, and then which can be later plugged into the regional level and then so on for the international level. So that is something that maybe certain kind of a non-governmental organization can look into, and then possibly share the resource at a public domain, which is beneficial to the decision makers, policy makers, and to the local citizens. So I would like to end here.
Thank you, Niyati. I agree, and a very important contribution. So over to Lina on this issue, because many times that humanitarian response, both aspects are involved, the restrictions also as well as the cooperation also. So how do you look at this?
Yes, thank you, Professor Gupta. As our other panelists, I partially agree with Professor Grover. I agree that it is important to take a multi-stakeholder approach to disaster management. You cannot only rely on the state, but however, I I still believe there needs someone to lead, someone to bring everyone together to make sure coordination is working, information exchange and sharing is going on. Many of the issues arising from past experience, for example, is that this coordination didn't work well. If in what we should do in regional cooperation is to build these kind of mechanisms to enhance coordination between different stakeholders, between states, between the civilian agencies and the military partner responders, because it's often the case that the military has the capacity, has the skills and the equipments and all that, but there is still insufficient communication or coordination between the military and civilian actors. And of course, it is very important to engage or involve the NGOs, civil society groups in decision making. And the issue I have with emphasizing too much about non-state actors like the companies, the civil societies, is like how sustainable their commitment can be. As Professor Groover mentioned, the companies are primarily for profit. Then how are you going to make sure that they can commit every time when disasters strike? And for humanitarian organizations or NGOs, many of them have funding issues. So except for the major ones. So in the end, people will find it still relies primarily on the state to deliver. So I believe what's more realistic is to emphasize coordination, cooperation. And the next one will be knowledge management. Although we believe that, we know so much about what happened in the past, but in the end, because people leave because of the rotation or turnover rate in organizations, you need some organization or entity to keep the knowledge from the past, and in the meantime also need to be forward-looking, because COVID is really magnificent in many ways, significant in many ways. We didn't expect this kind of scale, so it need to be more forward-looking to think boldly. Yeah, that's my
thank you, Dr. Lina. In fact, in India also, and now at regional level also, the concept of geo-NGO corporate cooperation that we are looking at. In fact, during COVID, we have seen that certainly even if the corporate system have the profit-making interest, but earlier many countries, they were not having the manufacturing of even masks or the PPE kits. So many of the startups have come, and then the accessibility and availability of these systems were made very easy. So sometimes these are also very good innovations where private sectors can also contribute good. And when it comes to funding issues, so CSR also offers good opportunity. So sometimes how do we really work out this strategy, that can also be helpful. So thank you for your intervention. Now finally we come to Dr. Shreya for your quick remarks.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Gupta. In fact, I couldn't agree more from your point. You probably nailed everything when you talked about, as Dr. Lina also said, that while NGOs can have funding issues, definitely, corporates are only very profit driven. So we need a certain kind of, an issue-based partnership. And also parallel partnerships between, at the civil society level, at the government level, as well as, also involving the public-private partnership. And because it's ultimately, it's seen, every time any kind of, transboundary flood takes place, it's the downstream countries, they allege that upstream countries did not give them information. They did not give them timely data. They did not give them flood warning. There have been complaints that post-disaster humanitarian assistance by regional and global powers misses the humanitarian perspective and is only involved in the geopolitical games. We all agree that unconditional sharing of water, climatic, environmental, geophysical data between countries is crucial for disaster prevention. But again, data is seen as a means of power to possess rather than as a resource to be shared, unfortunately. What we can do is, maybe, again, I come to minilateral organizations or multilateral organizations. So something like a BIMSTEC. Again, there are lots of issues, but something like a BIMSTEC in the last few years, we see the countries have initiated discussions on closer cooperation on disaster management. There have been joint exercises, there have been more sharing of information, at least talks about sharing of information, at least talks about capacity building on the early warning system, all of these things. So ultimately, it is coming together of all of these three, different entities together for a more holistic view. And also, it can't be on a, again, we've all talked about it, it can't be, after a disaster, then we are taking steps. It has to be an ongoing process. We have to be, we have to be prepared for disaster.
Thank you. Thank you, Shreya. It's very good point, and I totally agree that data is very important aspect. And how do we enable the data sharing system? First of all, how do we enable the database management system first of all? And second thing, that even if the data is there, how do we really use it in a very, very easy way? So that is also there, because a lot of data exists, but the people are not having the capacity to use it. Even the simple rainfall data of 30 years or 50 years. How do we, our officials at district and taluka level, and the similar kind of situations persist in many of the countries in the region. So I think that is also a very important aspect. So I think these rounds of interventions by the panelists during this panel discussion has been really very, very useful, and 4-5 very key points have emerged. One is certainly related with data, other is related with the capacities, third is the framework for technological interventions are like the crowdsourcing or the web platform related systems. Then how do we learn from each other? So that, and more particularly during the non-disaster phase, when there is no disaster. And how do we bring that paradigm shift that we have been talking about, that the shift from response-oriented approach to prevention and mitigation approaches. And certainly these are very important when we realize that infrastructure growth is on fast pace, but disasters are impending, and these disasters are causing more and more damage and loss to our livelihood. Even the agriculture related issues, livelihood related issues are prominent. So I would be certainly looking forward to the report of this discussion, and now we will be having a brief Q&A session also. So for that, before that, I say thanks to all my co-panelists and the speakers, and over to you, Laura, for taking the agenda forward.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we have a couple questions in the chat box, and Nayati answered Bashir's in written form, and then Himanshu answered Happy Mun's in written form, so we can revisit those. But why don't we first start with Helena Varkey's question, who says, thank you so much for the fantastic discussion. I want to raise the issue of blame and how this may affect cooperative disaster response. I'm thinking of things like transboundary haze pollution in Southeast Asia, where finger pointing between source and victim countries has very much limited the effectiveness of regional disaster management. Are there similar cases in other parts of the Indian Ocean, and have there been successful strategies to overcome this problem? So whoever wants to take that can go ahead. You can take the floor. Dr. Grover, yeah.
I'll kind of give you, I don't know about similar things in the Indian Ocean, but I do know about this problem, about haze pollution in the region, and how Indonesia and the South Asian countries have been having an issue regarding forest fires in one country impacting all the haze in the other countries. You can't avoid finger pointing or blaming. I mean, that will happen. But if before the problem there was an existing way to communicate and to talk to each other, it would have been better. So one of the things in disaster research, we always say that disasters don't bring out new problems, they just magnify the existing problems. So these countries have had existing issues of insecurity and of problems with one another, and disasters only magnify those. So successful cooperation only if they can find a common ground. So typical, I would say, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of case studies on using conflict resolution methodologies, environmental, cross-boundary issues, some of those techniques to help. Some of the things, I think it's more of it's just highlighting what's already there. So they need to kind of come together, and there has to be some kind of facilitation between the two countries to achieve some common ground.
Would anyone like to add on that?
I would just, again, I agree with Dr. Manshu on this. We've seen this happening, as I said, in terms of in cases of transboundary floods, as I again pointed out in the earlier point. So there will be in international relations, as I think it was pointed out earlier, that it's these issues that are underlying issues that exist between countries do come out at the time of disasters. The only way to deal with it is to have an ongoing communication throughout. I think that's the only way forward.
I'm going to move on to the next question. Perhaps if the panelists want to raise their hand, if they'd like to answer, that would be an easier way to keep it organized. So I see that part of Bashir's question wasn't answered, so why don't we revisit that one first? So Bashir writes, the Asia-Pacific Disaster Report of 2021 highlighted that despite better developments in risk management infrastructure, government responses and interventions during the pandemic fell short because they hadn't been sufficiently granular or hadn't been updated quick enough to keep pace with the virus. Will greater multilateral cooperation help to mitigate this? And does China's shadow loom over the possibility of such cooperation? That's a loaded question, but who would like to take that on? Dr. Grover, you can hand it up.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I mean, I can initially give you just a basic stuff because we worked a little bit. We've been looking at in the US, especially as to, how the response has been. I have not seen much difference reports from any other country. It was bad. None of us was prepared. So it wasn't something that we could have easily been prepared for. Of course, again, what happened was systems that were more weak broke faster and earlier, and there were more loss of life. And that did not happen in other areas where the systems are much stronger. But yes, the idea of being of the response being more being able to be ramped up quickly and all, that is always a challenge. It will depend on, again, your capacity of the country. And regarding the China shadow loom over the possibility of cooperation, I would say it will always be there, China or somebody else. It's just not China. I would say always the bigger regional partner or the region. I mean, there'll always be a kind of a, like my 2-year-old says, there's a wolf coming. So there's always be a wolf in the region, and you'll have to deal with that. Go ahead.
Dr. Gong.
To add to Professor Grover's response, I would like to point out that actually there have been the response mechanisms in place. However, I believe it's not sufficiently activated. And another issue is the scale of the disaster or the pandemic is beyond the expectation or the plan. So as I mentioned earlier, it's quite important to be forward-looking and to establish take a more comprehensive approach to deal with disasters. While as the disaster is unfolding, it is important to have some kind of unit in place to kind of assess the situation, to predict the possible consequences, or what are the spillover effects. So my reflections on that is first to be forward-looking, second to have institutional reform or transformation to make the either national institutions or even regional institutions to be more flexible, to be more efficient in responding to disasters. And with regard to whether multilateral cooperation will help, I believe yes. It's just like we need the mechanism to make them work work more effectively, because in the end, we have seen a lot of shortages during the pandemic response. Some countries have a lot, but some don't have it sufficient. So we need this kind of arrangements to ensure, or at least to reach some kind of balanced distribution. Thank you.
We'll do Professor Gupta and then Ms. Gupta.
What I would say that the recent trend in disasters is of the black swan events, basically. So the COVID has also given a lesson. Not only the black side of it or the negative side of it, certainly the countries had a very undulating terrain of the health level preparedness, particularly health infrastructure, and the preparedness to deal with any kind of major epidemics are there was seldom any thought process for dealing any major pandemic. So instead of just thinking that what can shadow the efforts, rather this is a great opportunity to gear up and make the cooperation effective, to foresee that what are the more such kind of incidences possible in the future. Maybe health related challenges or any other kind of disaster also. Like during this pandemic, we also saw the major locust attack that was relatively much more widespread as compared to the previous such kind of attack. So certainly there are implications of climate change, there are implications of social and other anthropogenic changes as well. So we have to think that what can go wrong, and if it goes wrong, how large will be the impact. So this is an important aspect, that preparing and cooperating to deal with the risk of black swan events, like the events that are the least possible but is still believed to be taking place, but when there are a lot of uncertainties. Yeah. So thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight something on the idea of granularity of the data itself. There are two particular issues with it. One, when we are talking about the freeways that you talked about, like Dr. Grover talked about in one of his answers that he has put over the Q&A, that there are a lot of free data which is available either from USGS sites or the Google Map data, which can be superimposed with the kind of modeling or the kind of mining with respect to the disaster risks that we are looking into. But the issue with that is, like, if that particular data is to be recognized by the state governments or the government of India, so the freeways are usually not recognized. That kind of raw data is not recognized. While if you are doing the let's say if you are taking the data by ISRO, so that is well recognized by the state or the national governments, but that cannot be put in the public domain, which is the sole agenda. So the granularity is also affected with respect to the data discrepancies in terms of the raw data, the acquiring of the raw data itself. So, and that is a huge challenge when you are talking about real-time analysis and the granularity of the situation that we are trying to address, to either through forest fires or pandemic or whatsoever, which can affect the international boundaries as well.
Thank you so much. So we're just approaching the closing time. So perhaps just for the next 2-3 minutes, I'll just read aloud Happy Mom's question, which Dr. Grover answered, but others may have their thoughts as well. So he wrote, here's a question for any panelist who wants to take it. How do we envisage disaster risk resilience partnership in the Indo-Pacific, ad hoc or institutionalized, which works better, and who are some of the preferred partners and type of partnerships that smaller states in the region are keen on? And then he said, I ask this because of the potential geopolitical concerns smaller states in the region may have on institutional setups created by bigger powers. So if anyone wants to take that on, just limit your answer though to 1 or 2 minutes, because we're going to wrap up at 12:05. Sure, Dr. Lina.
Actually, we have conducted research on regional mechanisms on disaster management in the Indo-Pacific. And our finding is that, yes, there exist various sub-regional mechanisms, such as Southeast Asia. We have ASEAN in South Asia. There are IORA, there are BIMSTEC, there are SAC. So it's not easy to bring the whole Indo-Pacific region together to have a very comprehensive one. So I believe it is necessary to enhance the dialogue between different regional, sub-regional mechanisms to facilitate information sharing, to facilitate sharing of best practices, lessons learned. With regard to the model of partnership that is preferred or that might be feasible for small states, I believe the first, it's quite important to adhere to the principle of the primary role of the state affected. So respect their sovereignty, non-interference, although it sounds quite diplomatic, but in reality, these are the examples, principles that still followed by countries, at least at countries and regional level. So that's my intervention. Thank you.
We have time for one more response if anyone would like to give a response. Otherwise, we'll move to the closing, okay? Okay, so it looks like we're wrapping up. It's actually really great timing. We wanted to end by 12 to 12:05 and it's 12:02. So I wanted to give a really big thank you, one, to the attendees. As the 12-minute mark or noon mark came, a lot of people left, but still thank you to everybody who came. And our live stream on YouTube, we weren't able to get it working, but we'll be uploading the recording. So unfortunately, people couldn't engage live there, but they'll engage after the fact, I'm sure. And I'll send that link to all of you. And then I am just going to put again, that's our IPC URL. And thank you to our chair, Professor Anil Gupta, and thank you to our panelists, Dr. Lena Gong, Dr. Himanshu Grover, Dr. Shreya Upadhyay, and Ms. Nayati Gupta. Please keep in touch, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.